Now back to the Sunday Show with Donald Nelson and Phillip O'Donald on KTOY.
Welcome back to the show, and thanks for staying with us during the break. Now, we have with us this morning some very important people, and you know them, because they are special people who do special things every special day. They are none other than Dr. Jacqueline O'Donald, who is housed. Go ahead.
That's just saying good morning.
Okay. I thought you said I want to be Jackie, but in the meantime, she's housed at the Column and Chronic Clinic here. She's our doctor, and I just have to, throw it in, and she's my co-host, honey.
Boy, I tell you, she easy to love.
I bet she is.
She's easy to love. I'm just thankful.
All right. Blessed. And then Dr. Charles Fortenberry, who's housed at the Crystal St. Michael Rehabilitation Center. Good morning, Dr. Jackie and Dr. Charles.
Good morning.
All right. It's good to have you all with us this morning, and we're going to do a little discussing things about the traumatic brain injuries, and we're going to talk about a few other things. And so I always get excited when I'm around Phillip. He reminds me when I was younger, because I used to be young and handsome like that too, and haven't looked this bad all my life, okay? In the meantime, we mentioned to you that we had some important people here, so we're just going to turn the show loose and let them do what they do.
Okay. Well, I thank you for giving us the time to get into this topic, because it's important. But even before that, I'd like to express how honored we are to have this opportunity, especially on the birthday of Martin Luther King, one of my heroes, and someone who I've always thought very highly of, and we owe so much to him for all that he did, and especially for all that he sacrificed. So I think it's appropriate to kind of lead into the topic with a little story that was recently published in the Chicago Tribune. I'm sure to commemorate this day, and I'll just read it to you. Just excuse my grammar. On this muggy Friday afternoon, August 5th, 1966, Martin Luther King stepped out of the car that had ferried him to Marquette Park on Chicago's southwest side to lead a march of about 700 people. The civil rights leader and his supporters were in the white ethnic enclave to protest housing segregation. Thousands of jeering, taunting whites had gathered. The mood was ominous. One placard read, "King would look good with a knife in his back." As King marched, someone hurled a stone. It struck King on the head. Stunned, he fell to one knee. He stayed on the ground for several seconds. As he rose, aides and bodyguards surrounded him to protect him from the rocks, bottles, and firecrackers that rained down on the demonstrators. King was one of 30 people who were injured. The disturbance resulted in 40 arrests. Later he explained why he put himself at risk. "I do this to expose myself to bring this hate into the open." He had done that before, but Chicago was different. "I've seen many demonstrations in the South, but I've never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today," he said. And about a little photograph of King. He's kind of holding the right side of his head, and later he said, I think the people from Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate."
All right.
It's a direct quote from King. And that leads us into our discussion of head injuries. Dr. King obviously suffered a head injury and probably a concussion on that occasion. Luckily, the damage was not permanent, and he was able to carry on from that. Before we get into the topic, I think we'll do a little bit of basic anatomy. Something I always enjoyed. It kind of took me back to medical school to review a lot of this stuff. So I brought a friend along. I brought Fred.
All right.
And unfortunately, all that's left of Fred is his head. So I think to lead it off, we'll begin with kind of a little quiz. Have a little fun with this. I'm sure your listening audience, and I know Dr. O'Donnell can nail this, so I'm not going to even bring them into it. But how about the fellas here? I'm holding a skull. How many bones make up the human skull? And I'll help you out. We won't count the mandible, which is the lower jaw, and of course we're not going to count teeth. Teeth are not bones, and we're not going to count the ossicles, the little bones inside the ear, incus malleus stapes. But well, actually, we will count them. I'll give you those. Those are 3 on each side, so that's 6. Okay, so
I was
tell you
thinking
what,
a huge number like
and
250. So obviously, and you done start taking stuff out. So
whoever wins gets this nice red apple. That's what the apple is here
red,
for.
delicious apple too.
Yeah. You wash it off real good before you bite into it.
33. I'm down from 250 to 33.
Yeah.
Okay, how about Mr. Nelson?
Let's see. I'll say about 2.
About 2?
Yeah.
I'm gonna go down to 22. How about that?
Okay, well, Phillip wins. What? The number is closer
I
to
give
30.
No, you and Fred either.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. The skull is made up of several bones that are all fused together, so it looks like one big bone, but it's actually very complex, and there's a lot going on there.
Now tell me again, how many bones? Because I may be asked that question again on Jeopardy.
Yeah, well, we're going to say 30. We're going to go with 30. There are different estimates, and it depends on how you count the bones.
Okay.
But I would go with the higher number rather than the lower number.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So that's basically the skull. The brain, of course, sits inside of this little fixed compartment. I have little latches here on Fred. And unfortunately, your listening audience is not going to catch a lot of that, but the brain sits inside of there. And we'll go right to the topic. Of course, the frontal part of the brain, the frontal part of the skull is the hardest part of the skull. And if we go down a little bit into the anatomy, the brain is covered by several layers called the meninges, which is just a fun word to say, meninges, but it's actually 3 layers. The dura mater lines the skull, lines the interior of the skull itself. The arachnoid is between the dura and is between the dura and the pia. The pia mater actually lines the brain itself. So, and that has some implications when you start talking about the kinds of injuries that the brain can sustain, because a lot of the problems that you get with brain injuries have to do with where the bleeding is coming from. Skull fractures take generally 3 types. There are generally 3 types of skull fractures. A linear skull fracture is just a random crack in the skull that can go off in any direction. A depressed skull fracture is when you have kind of a plate of skull that's smashed down into the brain substance, to give a kind of a graphic description.
Yes, sir.
A diastatic skull fracture is something that you see more in little children, little babies whose sutures are not quite fused. So they'll kind of separate a little bit, and it's hard to really see that, but you kind of know what's normal, and when it separates, you can kind of see it pushed out a little bit. The most serious type of skull fracture is the basal skull fracture, which occurs below the basal skull. This is the base of the skull. Underneath there, there are very soft bones underneath there, but they're very important. And of course, the brainstem comes down below, comes out this large hole at the bottom of the skull. So the fracture itself kind of approaches the larger portion of that brainstem, and what we often see is a leaking of the fluid that surrounds the brain associated with that basal skull fracture, and that can lead to all kinds of problems. Tough to diagnose, tough to fix, and tough to live with too. So gotta be careful about that. The substance of the brain itself is, of course, always affected when you're talking about a traumatic brain injury. As a matter of fact, we don't worry so much about skull fractures as we do about the injury to the brain itself. The skull is a bone; it will heal, but the substance of the brain is really what bothers us the most. So hemorrhage is a huge problem when you talk about brain injury, because not only are you losing blood supply to some part of the brain, but the cavity that the brain sits in does not expand. So whenever you have bleeding inside of this little small area, there's nowhere for the blood to go. So it'll actually squash the brain and inhibit other functions of the brain that were not even associated with the injury. So often when we see people recovering from these kinds of bleeding injuries in the brain, decompressing that hematoma, decompressing the blood, has a huge impact on how well they can recover and how quickly they recover. Briefly, the kinds of injuries that we usually see include epidural. As we mentioned, the meninges cover they're the outer tougher layer of the brain, and when you have bleeding in that area, it actually pushes that layer forward and into the brain itself, but the bleeding is not actually affecting the substance of the brain. Then you have the subdural, which is below that layer, and there's a pretty characteristic appearance that it has when you look at a CAT scan of the brain. It just kind of follows the contours of the brain itself. And we see that often with our elderly population, folks who maybe are taking blood thinners and then fall down. Am I on track there, Dr. O'Donnell?
You are. You're filming, yes. One of the major ones.
Sure. And we often recommend people take aspirin to to prevent problems with the heart. However, aspirin is a platelet inhibitor, which
Can cause bleeding.
yeah, can cause bleeding. So you're taking your aspirin as you're supposed to do, and you fall down, have a minor head injury, you would think, but because of the platelet inhibiting function of the aspirin, you're at risk for getting bleeding in the brain. More serious kinds of injuries, often associated with a higher level of force, include contusion or intracerebral hematoma, and that's when you actually are disrupting parts of the brain substance down in the brain. You're seeing some hemorrhage. Those are tough to manage. Neurosurgeons often will leave those alone because getting to the area where the blood is would require you to go through some other parts of the brain. So, if you have that as a component of your injury, you're going to have to wait and see. The body will have to heal itself pretty often. And then there's the fourth, which is much more frustrating and confusing, and that's diffuse axonal injury. And I'm sure our veterans are familiar with that. Just imagine the scenario: someone is driving along in their Jeep on patrol, and there's an IED that explodes. It's a huge amount of force that strikes them, and they're brought in for analysis, and there's no specific lesion there. There's no bleeding. Sometimes there's no fracture of the skull or anything, yet the person won't wake up. And scientifically, what we found, and usually it's after autopsy, is that the person has some diffuse injury to the axons, to the brain itself on a microscopic level, and they just are not able to recover because the electrical function of the brain is not working properly.
So the force of the bomb affects their brain, and you can't see an injury, and it can kill them. Mm-hmm. And it's like you can't figure out what it was until you do the autopsy.
That's often the case.
Wow.
That is often the case, and again, it's very frustrating to deal with, because of course there are different levels of it. Some people have very minimal impairment. Sometimes it manifests as different behavior, or maybe depression, or even some sorts of psychosis. And other times, of course, you'll see a person who has lost function altogether, lost consciousness. So it runs through a very broad spectrum, but very frustrating because you really can't see it.
Okay.
To briefly piggyback on that, a diffuse axonal injury is the same thing that we see with shaken baby syndrome. So can you imagine what happens to a baby?
Okay.
It's the same injury.
Certainly appreciate Dr. Fortenberry at this point taking us back to college. In fact, he took me back to high school when he asked about it. I can't believe I said 2. You know, I just sit up there and said, now, our kid in kindergarten knows better than that. You talked about the 30 some odd bones, and I'm sure there's some time in because I remember some of the classes that I took where we were required to name the different bones, and so if there were 30, I'm sure it's somewhere in your anatomy class you were required to name all of those. Okay, but what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to kind of ask, you know, when you talk about brain injuries and you or Dr. O'Donald can address this. When there are concussions, you know, we're talking about athletic and football concussions or whatever the case may be. Generally, what does that particularly mean? In the meantime, we're going to a break. We'll be right back.